The wind in Indianapolis that evening was the kind that crawled under coats and settled into bones. It carried a damp chill, the kind that whispered of early snow and long nights, and wrapped itself around the sidewalks of the aging city like an old lover. Skyscrapers stood like sentinels, windows glowing orange and blue against the darkening sky. Cars moved sluggishly through downtown, their tires hissing over wet pavement as traffic thickened with the approach of rush hour. Neon signs flickered and buzzed, half alive, half forgotten. A siren wailed somewhere in the distance. Thatcher Reinhardt sat in the back seat of a black town car, watching the familiar skyline, with an expression that had long since forgotten how to soften. His jaw was locked in a way that made him look perpetually disappointed, though that wasn't entirely accurate. It wasn't disappointment, it was detachment. Everything in his life had been calculated for efficiency, control, and profit. The past, irrelevant. Emotion, distracting. But something about coming back to this city after 20 years scraped against his carefully constructed indifference. He was here on business, of course. Raintech Motors, his billion-dollar empire, was preparing to acquire a local startup working on advanced lithium batteries. It was a strategic expansion, one that would secure his dominance in the electric vehicle market. There was no personal reason for returning to Indianapolis. None at all. At least that's what he told himself. The car came to a slow stop near an old gas station, one of those forgotten corners of the city where the lights never fully worked and the air always smelled faintly of fried oil and hopelessness. The driver, a silent man named Carl who'd been with him for 5 years, stepped out to check on the fuel situation. Thatcher, feeling restless and slightly suffocated by the enclosed space, pushed the door open and stepped out into the evening air. The cold hit him like a slap, but he welcomed it. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored wool coat, smoothed his cashmere scarf, and turned slowly, taking in the storefronts, the rusted signage, the cracked concrete beneath his $3,000 shoes. And then he saw her. She stood beneath the yellow glow of a flickering street lamp, holding a handmade cardboard sign. Her posture was stiff, defensive, and exhausted. One arm cradled a child, swaddled tightly in an old blanket, the baby's small head tucked into her chest. The other arm held the sign against the wind. It read, in uneven black marker, "Baby formula. Please, anything helps." People walked past her like she was invisible. A man in a business suit glanced, hesitated for half a second, then looked away and crossed the street. A woman with 2 shopping bags gave her a disapproving glance, as if poverty was contagious. She didn't call out, didn't beg. She simply stood there, her eyes distant but alert, her body a quiet fortress. Thatcher froze. He couldn't explain it, not even to himself, but something about her face made his stomach twist. It wasn't pity. He'd seen desperation before. Hell, he'd climbed out of it himself. This was something else, a strange flicker of recognition, like hearing a song you haven't listened to in years and still remembering every lyric. Her eyes, her bone structure, the set of her jaw, they ignited an ancient ache in him, a memory he had long buried beneath success and silence. He found himself walking toward her before he even realized it. The sound of his shoes echoed against the empty sidewalk. She noticed him when he was about 10 feet away. Her gaze flicked to his face, then down to his coat, his shoes, and back up again. She tensed slightly as if bracing for rejection or judgment. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said quickly, hands half raised in surrender. His voice was deeper than he remembered, rough around the edges. "I just saw your sign." She said nothing, only nodded once. Her eyes were a piercing shade of green-blue like the inside of a glacier. Her skin was pale, but not from makeup, from cold and hunger. She shifted the baby in her arms slightly, pressing him closer to her chest for warmth. Thatcher reached into his coat and pulled out his wallet. "Let me buy you some formula," he said, already thumbing out several crisp $100 bills. "There's a store 2 blocks down. Or do you want me to go get it and bring it to you?" She stared at the money for a moment, then back at his face. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, raw, but steady. The question hit him harder than he expected. Why? Why indeed? He swallowed. "Because no one else is stopping. Because it's cold. Because you shouldn't be out here like this." She hesitated. Then slowly, reluctantly, she took the bills with her free hand and folded them into her coat pocket. "Thank you," she said. Her eyes didn't soften, not yet. They stayed wary, alert. I'll buy the formula myself. I don't need a chaperone. Thatcher nodded. There was a sharpness in her tone that he recognized. Pride layered over pain. Strength grown from necessity. He watched her adjust the blanket around the baby, whose tiny hand had emerged from the fabric and was now gripping a corner of her coat. Then, as if something inside him was pushing him past his usual limits, he asked, "What's your name?" She looked at him then, really looked. He saw the hesitation in her eyes, the calculus of whether to trust or dismiss him. "Eshlin," she said finally. "Eshlin Vale." The world tilted. His breath caught. Not visibly, not enough for her to notice, but inside him something cracked open. Eshlin. Vale. His knees felt suddenly weak. "Vale?" he echoed, his voice suddenly unfamiliar to his own ears. She nodded. "Yeah, you know it." He swallowed again, barely managing to keep his face neutral. "Just sounds familiar," he murmured. She shifted her weight from one leg to the other, clearly growing uncomfortable. "Look, thanks for the help, but I need to go before it gets colder. Cal's already got a cough." Kyle, the baby had a name. Of course he did. "Let me walk with you," Thatcher said. "Just until the store. I'm not trying anything. I swear." Eshlin studied him for a moment longer, then gave a reluctant shrug. "Suit yourself." And so they walked, the billionaire and the beggar, side by side in the chill of the Indianapolis night. She didn't know he was rich, didn't know his name, didn't know he had once loved a girl named Marigold Vale, with the kind of reckless passion that made gods jealous and fools of men. And he didn't know, not fully, not yet, that the young woman walking beside him was about to change everything he thought he knew about the life he had built and the past he had tried to forget. But something deep inside him already suspected the truth, and it terrified him. The corner store was small, dimly lit, and smelled faintly of stale bread and overripe bananas. The kind of place that existed more out of habit than profit. Shelves leaned with age, half-stocked with off-brand goods in dust-coated jars. A flickering fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead as Eshlin pushed open the glass door with her shoulder, the baby still pressed tightly to her chest. A small bell above the door jingled weakly. Thatcher followed a few steps behind, unsure why he was still there, but certain that walking away would feel like abandoning something important, something sacred. She moved with practiced precision, heading straight to the infant formula aisle. She didn't browse or hesitate. This wasn't a casual errand. It was survival. She picked up one canister of powdered formula, turned it over to check the expiration date, then placed it carefully in her basket. Cal stirred against her, letting out a faint, tired whimper. She reached into her coat and found a pacifier, tucking it gently into the baby's mouth with one hand, while still holding the basket with the other. Thatcher stood a few feet away, watching her with a kind of stunned stillness. There was no fragility in her movements, no dramatics, just quiet resilience, the kind that didn't come from inspiration, but from necessity. She moved like someone who had learned long ago that the world didn't offer help unless you tore it from its hands. He had seen that kind of strength before, in himself, but in her, it hit different. It felt like a reflection he didn't remember casting. "You're good with him," he said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was low and for once, not calculated. Eshlin didn't look up from the shelves as she replied, "Yeah, well, you get good at what you do every day. That's how life works, right?" He offered a quiet nod, though she wasn't watching him to see it. "You his only caregiver?" he asked. Her spine stiffened slightly. "Is that your way of asking if I'm a single mom?" "No," he said quickly. "Not like that. Just wondering if you have any support." She turned to face him then. Her eyes weren't just tired. They were suspicious, guarded, like she'd had too many strangers try to disguise pity as kindness. "If you're trying to figure out if I've got some man waiting to swoop in and take care of us, don't bother. It's just me. It's been just me since the day I found out I was pregnant." Thatcher hesitated, unsure how to respond. "I'm sorry, that must be hard." Her laugh was short, humorless. "You know, people always say that. That must be hard. Like it's some revelation. Of course it's hard. That's not the question. The real question is whether it's worth it." She looked down at Kyle, who had fallen back asleep against her chest. Her voice softened, just barely. "And it is, every damn day." They walked in silence to the checkout counter, where a sleepy teenage clerk barely glanced up from his phone. She paid with the money Thatcher had given her, keeping the change carefully folded into her palm. As they stepped back into the cold, she didn't thank him again. She didn't smile or look for approval, but she didn't tell him to leave either. They walked side by side down the empty street, the sounds of the city muffled beneath the weight of early winter. Thatcher found himself speaking again, unsure if it was curiosity or something deeper that drove him. "Your last name, Vale. Any relation to Marigold Vale?" He tried to keep his voice casual, but even he could hear the tightness beneath his words. Her reaction was immediate, sharp, and unmistakable. She stopped walking, her eyes narrowing slightly. "She was my mother," she said. "Why?" Thatcher felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather crawl down his spine. His mouth went dry. He forced himself to keep his face neutral, his voice steady. "I knew her. A long time ago?" Eshlin stared at him for a moment. "You said you weren't from around here." "I'm not anymore," he replied. "But I was. Before everything." There was a pause as the weight of the name settled between them. He saw the flicker of something cross her face. Curiosity, suspicion, pain. She shifted Cale's weight slightly and started walking again. "She died 2 years ago," she said. "Breast cancer. It was slow and cruel. By the end, she couldn't even hold Cale. She wanted to, but her body was too weak." "I'm sorry," Thatcher said, and meant it. The words came out ragged. "She was complicated," Eshlin continued. "Beautiful, smart as hell, but always sad, always waiting for someone who never came back." He felt his lungs tighten, like the air was suddenly too heavy. The weight of her words hit him in places he didn't know still had feeling. He wanted to ask more, wanted to confess, but now wasn't the time. "She ever talk about her past?" he asked carefully. "Bits and pieces," Eshlin said. "Said she loved once when she was young, a man she thought would stay, but he left. She never gave me his name. I asked, but she always changed the subject. I think it broke her heart. I think it broke more than that." Thatcher stopped walking. His hands were trembling, hidden in his coat pockets. He felt like a man walking backward through his own history, discovering the bones he never buried properly. A woman he had loved with every fiber of his youth, a child he hadn't known existed. And now this fragile thread of connection standing in front of him, not knowing what she meant to him, not knowing what he had lost. Eshlin turned to face him. "Why are you asking about her?" she said. Her voice wasn't angry, but it was no longer casual. He hesitated. He could tell her now. Say the truth. Let it out. But he couldn't. Not yet. He didn't even know how to begin. "I just remembered her," he lied softly. "Seeing you, I guess it brought something back." She didn't believe him entirely. He could see it in her eyes, but she let it go. For now. "Look," she said, "thanks for the formula. I don't know who you are or why you really stopped, but I appreciate it." He nodded slowly. "Do you have a place to stay tonight?" She looked away. "We're okay. I have a room at a shelter. Not much, but it's warm, and they don't ask too many questions." He nodded again, and this time his voice was firmer. "If you ever need help, more help, you can call this number." He reached into his coat and handed her a sleek black card. No company name, just a private number printed in silver. "Tell them Thatcher sent you." She took the card, glanced at it briefly, then tucked it into her coat without a word. She didn't promise anything, didn't say she'd call, but she didn't throw it away either. As she turned and walked off into the misty dark, the baby curled close to her. Thatcher stood alone under the dim streetlight, the cold wrapped tighter around him. But this time, it wasn't just the wind that made him shiver. He'd come to Indianapolis for business. He hadn't known he'd find his past. He hadn't known he'd find his daughter. Not yet. But the truth was moving closer. And it was only a matter of time. The suite Thatcher Reinhardt stayed in was on the top floor of the Whitmore Hotel, the tallest and most luxurious building in downtown Indianapolis. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a panoramic view of the city, twinkling with scattered light like a broken constellation. But the skyline meant nothing to him that night. He stood motionless in front of the glass, the cityscape a silent witness to the hurricane building in his chest. One hand rested in his pocket, the other clutched a glass of untouched bourbon. His reflection stared back at him, hollow-eyed and older than he remembered being. He hadn't heard that name in over 2 decades. Marigold Vale. And now, Like a ghost that had never truly departed, it came rushing back with the force of a tidal wave, drowning him in memories he had buried so deeply they no longer felt like his own. Yet every detail was still there, raw and vivid beneath the surface, waiting for the moment to surface. He closed his eyes and the past came to life. It was the summer of 2003. He was 21, cocky, brilliant, and painfully broke. A scholarship student at Purdue, he had picked up weekend shifts at an auto shop to cover rent and groceries. That's where he met her, Marigold. She was 19, working at a used bookstore 2 blocks over. She had hair the color of wet autumn leaves and eyes that seemed to hold entire novels inside them. She read Emily Dickinson on lunch breaks and carried a leather sketchbook everywhere, filling its pages with charcoal drawings of street corners, stray cats, and strangers who caught her attention. She caught his attention the moment she laughed. It was loud, unrestrained, and the farthest thing from polite. It echoed across the parking lot one hot July evening as he spilled coffee on his shirt. She laughed and offered him a paper towel and said something about how life has better aim than we do. That was it. He was done. Hooked. Their romance burned fast and wild, like dry pine in a winter fireplace. They spent nights under bridges and days in libraries. They kissed in the rain. They fought like their world depended on it. And they loved, God, how they loved. It had been the kind of love that made you feel invincible and doomed in equal measure. But things changed. They always did. Halfway through his final year, he was offered a coveted internship with a startup accelerator in Silicon Valley, an opportunity that could change everything. He told her it was temporary, just a few months, and when he returned, they'd move to Chicago together, start something real. She'd cried when he packed, hugged him so tightly it bruised his ribs, gave him her sketchbook to take with him. He remembered flipping through it on the plane, stopping at a page with his face in profile. She'd written in the corner, "Don't become someone else before I see you again." He had written to her every week, sometimes twice. Long, honest letters about missing her, about the chaos of tech startup culture, about dreaming of a future that had her in it. But after a month, the letters stopped coming back. No replies, no calls. Eventually, her number was disconnected. He tried to return home during Thanksgiving break to find her, but her apartment was empty. No forwarding address, no trace. It was like she had vanished from the earth. It shattered something in him that he didn't know could be broken. He buried it, told himself she had moved on. Maybe she'd found someone new. Maybe she realized their love had been more youthful intensity than real longevity. Whatever the reason, she hadn't waited. So he stopped writing, stopped asking. He let her ghost fade into the background of his ambition. But now she was back, through her daughter, their daughter, Eshlyn. He whispered her name into the empty suite, as if saying it aloud might make it more real. Eshlyn Vale, her face, her eyes. The way her chin jutted out when she was being stubborn, it was exactly like Marigold. And that baby, Kyle, that was his grandson. The math lined up. The resemblance was uncanny. He hadn't needed a paternity test to feel it, but now he knew he would get one. Just to confirm, just to be sure. But in his bones, he already knew. He set the bourbon down untouched, walked to the closet, and pulled out an old metal briefcase. It was locked with a code, his father's birthday. Inside were personal items he never opened, things he kept not out of nostalgia, but out of guilt. At the very bottom was a bundle of faded envelopes, each marked with Marigold's name and the return address of that studio apartment he'd lived in all those years ago. Every single one of them had been returned to sender, unopened. The handwriting on the return stamps looked harsh, almost aggressive. Some were stamped with, "No longer at this address," others with "refused." He ran his fingers over the flap of one envelope and opened it. Inside was a photo he'd sent her, a Polaroid from the first day of his internship. His hair was longer then, his smile looser, more innocent. On the back he had written, "Come find me when you're ready to change the world." He felt sick. He hadn't abandoned her. But from her perspective, from Eshlyn's, he had. And now what? Could he explain it away? Could he make up for lost time? What did he even have the right to ask? He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, the metal case still open beside him. Something caught his eye tucked in the side pocket of the lid. An old ring box. He'd forgotten he still had it. A cheap silver engagement ring with a tiny blue stone. He'd planned to give it to her the night before he left, but he chickened out, too afraid to lock in something permanent before his career even began. He opened the box slowly, stared at the ring, and whispered into the silence, "I would have stayed if I'd known." The weight of that sentence clung to the air like smoke. For a long time he didn't move. The city outside the window blurred in his peripheral vision. He could hear the low hum of the heater, the occasional honk of a car below. But none of it felt real. Only the past did. Only her. Eventually he stood, walked to his desk, and pulled out his laptop. He opened a private browser window and searched for a clinic that offered discreet DNA testing. There was one on the outskirts of the city, open early. He booked an appointment under a false name and closed the laptop. As he lay back on the bed, fully dressed, he stared at the ceiling with eyes wide open. Sleep wouldn't come. Not for him. Not tonight. Tomorrow he would see her again. And the truth, whatever it was, would rise from the ruins of everything he thought he knew. The sun hadn't yet risen when Thatcher parked his rental car in front of the bland brick building housing the DNA testing clinic. It was wedged between a shuttered dry cleaner and a vape shop that looked like it hadn't had a customer in weeks. The street was empty, the city still caught in the last breath of darkness before morning arrived to stir it awake. He sat in the driver's seat for several long minutes, his hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary, knuckles pale against the leather. There was a strange sensation settling in his chest. Not fear, not quite. Something colder. Like standing on the edge of a cliff and knowing that, one way or another, he would have to jump. He didn't need the test to tell him what he already felt in his bones. But facts had always been his armor, his compass. Emotion could be mistaken, feelings could deceive, but DNA didn't lie. That was why he had built his empire. On precision, on evidence, on certainty. This needed to be just as irrefutable. If he was going to face her again, if he was going to claim her as his daughter, he needed the truth in black and white. The clinic was quiet inside, almost sterile in its anonymity. The receptionist was a young woman in scrubs who didn't look up from her screen when he walked in. The walls were painted in that pale, institutional gray, meant to be inoffensive, but instead drained all warmth from the space. A faint scent of disinfectant lingered in the air. He gave the receptionist the alias he'd used when making the appointment. She barely blinked, simply motioned to a clipboard of forms and asked him to wait. He filled out the paperwork with mechanical precision, then was ushered into a back room where a technician with an efficient, impersonal manner swabbed the inside of his cheek. The entire procedure took less than 10 minutes. The results would be expedited, available in 48 hours, delivered electronically through a private portal. As he stepped back outside, the sky was lightening into a steel gray, and the first stirrings of traffic began to hum down the street. But the world around him still felt muted, distant, like he was watching life happen through a pane of glass. He slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and sat there without moving. What would he do if the test came back positive? Would he tell her? Would she even believe him? Would she want anything from him? Answers, apology, support? Or would she shut him out, too proud, too hurt, too convinced that the man who hadn't been there in her childhood had no right to step into her adulthood? And if it wasn't true, if by some twist of fate she wasn't his daughter, then what? Would he walk away? Could he? He shook his head as if trying to banish the uncertainty before it took root. For now, all he could do was wait. The next 2 days stretched into something unbearable. Thatcher tried to keep his mind occupied, throwing himself into meetings, approving project briefs, fielding calls from investors, but his focus kept slipping. The work felt distant, empty, like trying to read a book in a foreign language. Even his assistant noticed something was off, but she was too professional to ask. He appreciated the silence. He checked his phone obsessively, refreshing the email inbox tied to the test results. He wasn't sure what he expected to feel when the notification finally pinged. Maybe panic, maybe peace. But when it came late Thursday afternoon, all he felt was stillness. The subject line was clinical. DNA parentage test results. Confidential. He opened the email with slow, deliberate motions, as if rushing would change the outcome. The document loaded on his screen, lines of dense text and lab numbers that meant nothing until he reached the conclusion. Probability of paternity, 89, 98%. It hit him like a sledgehammer and a prayer at the same time. He closed his laptop slowly, sat back in the plush leather chair of his temporary office, and stared at nothing for a long while. Eshlyn was his daughter. There was no longer a maybe, no more room for doubt or denial. This was fact, undeniable, irrevocable. And with that fact came a flood of emotion he had no roadmap for. Regret, sharp and unrelenting, for all the years he'd missed. Anger, too, not at her, not at Marigold, but at the faceless forces that had stolen time from them. Sadness, hope, fear, love. The kind of love that was sudden and primal, that hit deep in the gut and didn't ask for permission to grow. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city that had once been his home, and now felt like the origin of a story he had never finished writing. Somewhere out there, his daughter was raising a child, his grandson, alone, scraping by with stubborn dignity. The thought was almost unbearable. He couldn't just show up and announce himself. He'd seen the look in her eyes, sharp, skeptical, feral in its protectiveness. She wasn't the kind of person who trusted easily, and if she felt betrayed, she would not forgive him quickly. He needed a way in, something that didn't feel like charity, but also didn't ignore the truth. Later that evening, he made a call to his legal team. He instructed them to create a trust, anonymous, untouchable by creditors or the government, designed for the long-term well-being of one Eshlyn Vale and her son Kyle. No conditions, no requirements. Just a safety net that he would never again allow his blood to go without. But that wasn't enough. Money was a tool, not a solution. He needed to see her again, speak to her, try at least to explain. The next morning, he drove to the women's shelter she'd mentioned, parked across the street, and waited. It was a modest building with faded blue siding and a small fenced-in courtyard. Around 8:30 a.m., he saw her emerge. Kyle strapped to her chest in a soft carrier, a tote bag over one shoulder. She was dressed simply in jeans and a worn hoodie, hair tied back into a messy bun, eyes scanning the street like she was always on alert. He didn't get out of the car. He just watched, heart thudding. She didn't know him, not really, not yet, but he knew her, and he knew what he had to do. He drove off, not wanting her to feel hunted or cornered. Instead, he called in a favor with one of his foundation directors and asked to arrange a meeting with Eshlyn Vale under the pretext of a new grant program for young mothers with entrepreneurial ambitions. It wasn't a lie. He would make the program real if he had to, but it was also the only way he could sit across from her again without her running. He needed to earn her trust, slowly, carefully, truthfully, because she wasn't just some woman he'd helped on the street. She was his daughter, and for the first time in his life, he was ready to be someone's father. It was a rainy Tuesday when Thatcher saw her again. Not by chance, but by arrangement. The foundation meeting had been scheduled in a quiet office space on the second floor of a community center, nestled between a dental clinic and a laundromat. The building had the tired air of good intentions and limited funding, with flickering lights in the hallway and posters peeling from bulletin boards. The elevator was out of order, so he took the stairs, his polished shoes echoing softly on the concrete steps. He arrived 10 minutes early and waited in a small meeting room, furnished with secondhand chairs and a wobbly table that someone had tried to fix with folded paper under one leg. A pot of lukewarm coffee steamed faintly in the corner, its scent bitter and burnt. He sat near the window, facing the door, his fingers laced tightly in his lap. He wore a simple navy sweater over a collared shirt, not the kind of suit that screamed wealth, but still too tailored to pass for ordinary. He'd tried to tone down the image, strip away the layers of corporate armor, but there was only so much he could do to hide who he was. He hoped it would be enough. The door opened quietly. Eshlyn stepped inside, carrying Kale on her hip and a plastic folder under her arm. Her eyes flicked around the room before landing on him. They narrowed instantly, suspicion flashing like lightning before a storm. "You," she said flatly. Not a question, but an accusation. Thatcher rose slowly, hands visible, unthreatening. "I know this looks strange. I asked to meet with you because I have something important to say. Something I should have said the first time we met." Kyle, sleepy and indifferent to the tension in the room, let out a soft hiccup and laid his head on his mother's shoulder. Eshlyn shifted him gently, never taking her eyes off Thatcher. "I thought this was a grant meeting," she said. Her voice was tight, clipped. "It is, or it could be," Thatcher replied carefully. "But that's not the real reason I asked you here. Please, just give me 5 minutes. Then if you want to leave, I won't stop you." She didn't sit. She stood by the door, chin lifted in defiance, the same way Marigold used to when she didn't trust someone. Thatcher's heart ached, but he pushed through. "I knew your mother," he began. "Marigold, a long time ago, when we were both kids practically. We were together. It was serious. We talked about the future, about building a life together. But I got an opportunity to leave for a tech internship out west, and I thought we'd stay in touch. Figure it out. I wrote her, Eshlyn, every week. I called. I never stopped trying. But one day she disappeared." Eshlyn's brow furrowed, her grip tightening on Cal. "She told me you left," she said slowly, "that you were gone before she could tell you. But she never gave details. Just said you were gone, that you didn't know." "I didn't," Thatcher said. "I had no idea she was pregnant, not until I met you that night. Something about your face, your eyes. I knew something was different. I had to know the truth. So I took a DNA test. I didn't want to believe it unless it was real." She said nothing. Her jaw clenched. "The test confirmed it," he said. "You're my daughter." The words hung in the air like thick smoke. Eshlyn blinked once, then again. Slowly she crossed the room and lowered herself into the chair across from him. Cal stirred, opened his eyes, and gave Thatcher a groggy, curious look before settling back into his mother's arms. "I don't know what you expect me to say," she said finally, her voice lower now, more uncertain. "You're 23 years late. That's a hell of a start for a father." "I don't expect anything," he said. "I just want to be honest, and I want you to know I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." "Why now?" she asked. "Why tell me at all? You could have walked away after the test. I would have never known." "I couldn't do that," he said. "Not again. I missed everything already. Your first words, your first steps, your graduation. I can't go back, but I can be here now, if you'll let me." She looked down at Cal, who was now gently chewing on the zipper of her hoodie. Her fingers ran over the soft fuzz of his hair. "You don't know me," she said quietly. "You don't know anything about my life." "I want to," he said. "I want to know everything." The silence stretched between them. Finally, she looked up again, her eyes fierce. "You don't get to just walk in and play dad. You don't get to throw money at me and think it'll fix anything." "I'm not trying to fix the past with money," he said. "But I'd be lying if I said I didn't want to make things easier for you. For him." He nodded gently toward Cale. "You're doing everything on your own, and I see how hard you fight. But you shouldn't have to fight alone." She swallowed hard. Her voice cracked. "Where were you when I was 6 and couldn't stop crying at night because Mom was too sick to get out of bed? Where were you when I dropped out of school to take care of her? Or when she died in my arms and I had no one left?" Thatcher's chest caved inward with the weight of her words. "I wasn't there," he said, barely a whisper. "And I will never forgive myself for it. But I'm here now. And if there's even the smallest chance you'll let me try to earn a place in your life, I'll take it." She looked at him for a long time. Then without a word, she unzipped Cale's carrier and let him stand on her lap. The baby reached out toward Thatcher, a gummy, drowsy smile blooming across his face. Tiny fingers stretched toward him, curious and unafraid. Thatcher reached back instinctively. His hand engulfed the baby's, warm and impossibly small. "He doesn't know who you are," Eshlyn said softly. "But babies have good instincts." A tear slid down Thatcher's cheek before he could stop it. He nodded once, gripping Cale's hand like it was a lifeline. In that moment, he didn't feel like a billionaire. He didn't feel like a powerful CEO. He felt like a man who had just been handed a second chance, one that had the weight of a lifetime behind it. And he wasn't going to waste it. Eshlyn had pulled it from the back of her mother's old storage unit, a dented plastic container sealed with brittle masking tape and covered in a light film of dust. She hadn't opened it since the day after Marigold's funeral, when the grief had still been too raw, and everything in her mother's handwriting had felt like a knife. But now, with Thatcher waiting silently in her small apartment's living room, she knew it was time. She carried the box carefully from the closet and set it on the scarred coffee table between them, Cale asleep in the next room. They didn't speak right away. She stared at the box. He watched her. The room was dim, lit only by a standing lamp in the corner, and the streetlight bleeding in through the blinds. Outside, the wind pressed soft whistles through the window panes. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation. Eshlin peeled back the brittle tape slowly, as if afraid the act might shatter something fragile. The lid creaked as she lifted it. Inside, there were piles of notebooks, envelopes, photo albums, bits and pieces of a life neither of them had touched in years. The scent of old paper and dried lavender rose faintly from the contents. "This is all I have left of her," Eshlin murmured. Her voice was not bitter, but reverent, as if speaking in a cathedral. "She kept everything, even things I didn't think mattered." She reached in and pulled out a faded photo. Marigold at 20, sitting on a stone wall in the park, sketchbook in her lap, her hair loose around her shoulders. There was something effortless about her in the picture, as if she had no idea how beautiful she looked, lost in her own world. Thatcher leaned forward, his eyes locking on the image, like a man who had just glimpsed a ghost. "I took that," he said quietly. "The second day we met." Eshlin looked up, surprised. "You were there?" "I was the one behind the camera. We were supposed to go for ice cream, but she saw something she wanted to draw and sat down right there. Said the light was perfect. I got impatient, so I started taking photos of her instead." A silence stretched between them, rich, not empty. It was the silence of two people standing at the edge of a vast, shared memory, one they'd never known they both carried. Eshlin turned back to the box and sifted through its contents more quickly now, until her fingers brushed a bundle of rubber-banded envelopes. She frowned, pulling them out and laying them on the table. "These are yours," she said slowly. "They're addressed from California. The return name says T. Reinhardt. You wrote to her." Thatcher nodded, barely breathing. "Every week for almost a year. I never got a reply. Eventually, the letters came back unopened." "I never knew about these," she said, her fingers trembling slightly as she untied the band and pulled out the top envelope. "She never told me." "I don't think she could," he said. "Whatever happened, whatever she went through, maybe she thought it was better if you didn't know." "But why?" Eshlin's voice cracked. "Why wouldn't she let me know you tried?" Thatcher didn't have an answer, not a satisfying one. He could only guess. He reached into the box and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. The initials MV were embossed on the front in faded gold. He opened it carefully, unsure if he had the right to even read what was inside, but needing to see, to understand. The first entry was dated September 2003. "He left. I told him to go. I didn't want to, but I saw the way his eyes lit up when he talked about California, about ideas and ambition. He's meant for something bigger. I'm not going to be the reason he gives that up." Eshlin leaned closer. Her voice was barely a whisper. "She let you go because she thought she was protecting you." Thatcher kept reading. "I found out today. I'm pregnant. I'm terrified. I want to call him, but I won't. His mother came by. She said he'd never forgive me if I told him, that it would ruin everything for him, that he had a future waiting, and I'd just be an anchor." He blinked, trying to process the words, but they blurred on the page. "I wrote him a letter. I didn't send it. I still have it. Maybe someday, when our daughter asks me who her father was, I'll show her. But I don't want her to grow up with resentment. I want her to know love, even if it comes from one parent." Eshlin sat back, eyes glassy, her lips pressed into a thin line. "She lied to protect you, and she protected me from the lie. She carried all of it herself." Thatcher nodded slowly, the weight of everything sinking into his chest. "She was stronger than I ever knew." "She always was," Eshlin said, her voice thick. "Even when she was sick, she'd still try to draw, even when her hands shook." They sat in silence for a while, surrounded by the soft rustle of old letters, the echo of memories never spoken aloud. Then at the bottom of the box, nestled between two sketchbooks, Eshlin found a small velvet pouch. She opened it carefully and pulled out a simple silver ring, the kind you might buy with the last of your savings and the first of your hope. The blue stone in the center was worn but intact. "She used to keep this in her jewelry box," she said. "I thought it was from my father. She never said anything about it." Thatcher exhaled shakily. "It was from me. I bought it before I left. I was going to propose that night, but I panicked. Thought it was too soon. I told myself I'd wait until I got back. The ring sat between them on the table, a relic of a future that had never happened. You loved her, Eshlin said. It wasn't a question. With everything I had, he answered, and I never stopped. Tears fell quietly down Eshlin's cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. I used to dream about him, you know. My dad. I used to imagine what he looked like, if he'd ever find me. I used to think he had to be dead, because how else could someone just never show up? I did everything I could, Thatcher said, his voice breaking, and it still wasn't enough. She nodded, eyes still fixed on the ring. It wasn't your fault. It wasn't hers. It was just life, and we're the pieces it left behind. He reached across the table slowly, cautiously, and placed his hand over hers. She didn't pull away. I don't expect forgiveness, he said, but if there's a path forward, any path, I'll walk it, every step, just to be in your life. She looked up, her eyes searching his face. For the first time, the edges of her expression softened. You already are. They sat like that for a long time, the ghost of Marigold Vale filling the room not with sorrow, but with quiet absolution. The box lay open, but its purpose was fulfilled. The past had spoken. And now perhaps the future could finally begin to whisper. In the weeks that followed the night they opened Marigold's box, a slow transformation began. Quiet, almost imperceptible at first, like the thawing of frost on early spring mornings. Nothing was sudden between Eshlin and Thatcher. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic shifts, only small steps that gradually closed the canyon of time and absence between them. Thatcher started visiting her more often, always careful not to overstep. He never came uninvited. Instead, he sent a message the evening before, asking if she and Cale were up for company. He never asked to be let into her life fully. He just kept showing up on her terms, and little by little she stopped saying no. At first his visits were brief, a half hour in the mornings to bring her coffee and walk Kyle to the park, or an hour in the evening while she folded laundry and Kyle waddled around chewing on plastic toy keys. He brought books for her, little things he thought she might like. Poetry, design theory, business memoirs. He never asked why she dropped out of college or what her dreams had been. He just started handing her pieces of the future, one suggestion at a time, without pressure. One morning, as they sat at a cafe across from the shelter where she was still living, he pulled out a slim envelope and slid it across the table. It's not money, he said before she could object. It's an offer. Just read it. She opened it cautiously. Inside was a letter offering her a paid position as a consultant for the Reinhardt Foundation's new outreach initiative, one she would help design from scratch. The goal was to create programs tailored for young, single mothers, resources, job training, affordable childcare, housing assistance. But he didn't want to run it from a boardroom. He wanted it built by someone who understood what those women needed from the inside. You said once that you got good at surviving, he said gently. I think that means you're exactly the kind of person who should be in charge of helping others do the same. She stared at the letter for a long time, her lips tight, eyes unreadable. Then she said, I haven't worked in 2 years. I don't even have a resume anymore. We'll make one, he said without hesitation. From scratch if we have to. You've done more than most people who sit behind desks in high-rises. You've managed a household, raised a child, and survived loss. That's leadership. She didn't respond right away, but she didn't hand the envelope back either. That was the first time she let herself consider that maybe she wasn't broken, just unfinished. Over the next few months, they began meeting with architects and social workers, planners and designers. She was hesitant at first, constantly questioning her own authority. But Thatcher never took over. He sat beside her during every call, deferred to her in every meeting, and reminded her with every quiet glance that she deserved to be there. Eventually, they found a small building on the east side of the city, an old daycare center that had been abandoned for years. Eshlin walked through the dust-covered halls with a clipboard in one hand and Cale on her hip, her eyes already picturing a future the space could hold. She pointed at rooms and called out ideas, one for career counseling, another for free childcare, a kitchen where mothers could learn meal prep and nutrition. Thatcher watched her with quiet pride, saying nothing, letting her lead. The project gained momentum. Local media picked it up after a leaked press release described it as a billionaire's reparation to a daughter he never knew. Thatcher had been furious, ready to sue, but Eshlin only laughed. "They're not wrong," she said, shrugging, "but that's not all it is. You're not just throwing money at me. You're showing up. That's different." He had nodded, his chest tightening with something fragile and grateful. As the center began to take shape, so did the relationship between them. They were still learning each other. Sometimes their conversations veered into awkward silence. Sometimes they misstepped. He offered too much. She pulled too far away. But they always came back. Apologies were given, not defensively, but with sincerity. Trust was something they built with every shared breakfast, every bedtime story he read to Kyle when she was too tired to keep her eyes open. One evening, while painting one of the office walls together, her in overalls, him in clothes far too expensive for a paintbrush, Eshlin looked at him and said, "You're good with him." Thatcher glanced at her, his brush mid-stroke. "Cal? Yeah, he likes you. He doesn't like most men. But he likes you." He smiled faintly. "It's mutual. He saved me, you know." I didn't realize how empty everything had become until I saw him looking up at me, like I was someone who mattered. Eshlin said nothing for a moment, then returned to painting. "He's never had a grandfather." "Now he does," Thatcher said quietly. As the days passed, she began sharing more about her mother. Not just the pain, but the good parts. The way Marigold used to hum when she cooked. The way she made up bedtime stories that went on for hours. The way her laugh filled the room like wind chimes. Thatcher listened without interrupting, letting her build a picture of the woman he had once loved in a way he had never truly known her. They never tried to pretend the past hadn't happened. They spoke of it openly. The missed years, the confusion, the hurt, and in doing so they found a strange kind of healing, not erasing the damage, but growing something new in its place. Then one day, something unexpected happened. It was during a planning event for the center's launch, a casual brunch hosted at a community garden downtown. Eshlin had just finished speaking to a small group of women, her voice strong, confident, even as Cale clung to her leg. When she stepped off the makeshift platform, a man approached her, tall with a quiet presence, dark hair tucked under a knit beanie, and hands rough from work. Thatcher watched as the man introduced himself. They spoke for several minutes, and though the conversation was clearly formal at first, he noticed the way Eshlin's mouth curved slightly, the way she tilted her head when she listened. When she laughed, really laughed, something fluttered in his chest. Later that day, she told him the man's name was Riven Hale. He was a systems designer volunteering his time to help the foundation digitize its intake process. He had lost his sister to domestic violence years ago and now devoted much of his time to supporting women's shelters through tech. He wasn't flashy. He didn't try too hard. He just showed up and he did the work. And Thatcher knew without a doubt that Riven would be important. He didn't say anything. He didn't tease or push. He simply watched his daughter speak with someone who saw her not as a case to solve or a burden to carry, but as an equal, as something bright. That night after Cale was asleep and Eshlin was putting dishes away, Thatcher sat on the worn couch and looked at the home she had made out of nothing. He thought of Marigold. He thought of the years lost. And he realized something. This wasn't the life he had imagined when he was 21. It wasn't the future he had once dreamed of, but it was better, realer, earned. He wasn't just repairing the past anymore. He was building a future, one that belonged to all of them. The morning of the launch arrived cloaked in thick gray clouds, the sky low and heavy, as if it too had been holding its breath for this day. The new Marigold Bloom Center stood proud and freshly painted on the corner of a street that had once been known for forgotten buildings and broken windows. Now it shone with life. The garden out front was full of color, sunflowers and wild tulips, even a few blooming roses that someone had donated last minute. The courtyard was strung with soft white lights, gently swaying in the breeze. And despite the forecast, people began arriving early, some with strollers, some with walkers, many with stories written in the lines of their faces. Inside, the room smelled of fresh wood and lemon cleaner. The childcare area had already been filled with laughter that morning, the sounds of toddlers tumbling over new toys and young mothers marveling at the calm of being able to breathe for just a few hours. There was a mural on the main hallway wall, a tribute to Marigold Vale, painted in delicate strokes and warm colors. Her face was not fully rendered, only hinted at with soft curves. But the heart of the image was unmistakably her essence. A woman cradling a child, surrounded by wildflowers and books. Thatcher arrived early, dressed simply in a gray blazer and slacks. No tie. He carried no security, no entourage, just a leather notebook and the kind of nervous energy he hadn't felt since his very first investor pitch decades ago. But this wasn't about investors. This wasn't even about money anymore. It was about legacy, the kind that was felt, not counted. He found Eshlin in the back conference room, kneeling by Kyle to fix the strap of his tiny shoe. Her hair was pinned back in a loose twist, and she wore a dark green dress that flowed when she moved, simple but elegant. She didn't look like a girl who had struggled alone for years. She looked like a woman who had survived, healed, and stood taller because of it. When she looked up and saw her father, her eyes warmed, and he felt it in his chest, that gentle ripple of pride that still surprised him every time he saw her like this. "You ready for this?" he asked softly, not wanting to break the moment. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, smoothing the dress over her knees and standing. "The weather's not perfect, but I guess we've learned to work with storms, haven't we?" He smiled faintly. "We always have." Guests began to fill the space. City officials, nonprofit leaders, women from nearby shelters, volunteers, donors, and strangers who had read the newspaper article and simply wanted to be part of something real. Thatcher stood in the back as Eshlin took the stage, stepping up to a small podium under the tent set up in the courtyard. The first drops of rain had begun to fall, light and tentative, as if unsure whether they were truly welcome. Eshlin cleared her throat, her fingers gripping the sides of the podium. But when she began to speak, her voice rang with clarity. "My name is Eshlin Vale," she began, "and for most of my life, I didn't know where I belonged. I knew what it meant to struggle, to work through grief, to carry more than one person should have to. I knew how to fight for a future without ever being sure there was one waiting for me. But what I didn't know was that sometimes family finds you when you least expect it." She paused, her gaze drifting briefly toward Thatcher, who met her eyes with a nod of quiet encouragement. "This center is named after my mother, Marigold. She was a woman who gave everything she had to the people she loved, even when it cost her too much. And now, thanks to the support of this community, and one man who never stopped trying to make things right, we're honoring her legacy by building something that helps others do more than survive. We're building a space for them to thrive." The audience was silent, hushed by the honesty in her words, the strength in her voice. Thunder rumbled in the distance, but the rain held off, falling in light sheets beyond the tent without interrupting the ceremony. Thatcher stepped up next. He hadn't planned to speak, but something inside him told him this was a moment that needed his voice. Not because he wanted to be heard, but because he needed to say the truth aloud. For her, for Marigold, for himself. He stood at the podium, hands resting flat on the surface, and took a breath. "I built a life on ambition," he began. "I chased goals, built companies, and told myself that legacy was about impact. But I've learned something recently. Something I wish I'd known a long time ago. Legacy isn't about what we leave behind in buildings or bank accounts. It's about who we show up for, even when it's late, even when we're broken, even when we're scared." He looked at Eshlin then, and his voice softened. "This woman, my daughter, is the best thing I've ever been part of. And this place, this center, is more than bricks and policy. It's a chance for all of us to remember that sometimes love doesn't arrive on time. Sometimes it stumbles through the door covered in old mistakes. But when it gets there, if it's real, it stays." There was no applause at first, just a heavy silence, thick with emotion. Then someone began to clap slowly, and the sound built until it filled the courtyard like distant thunder. Eshlin stepped forward and embraced her father in front of the crowd, her head on his shoulder, her arms not tight, but certain. After the speeches, the crowd lingered despite the dampness. Children played in the garden paths. Mothers toured the rooms. Guests asked questions, donated, signed up to volunteer. It was not a glamorous launch, but it was something more powerful, authentic, imperfect, but alive. Later, as the sky finally gave in to a full and gentle rain, Riven Hale arrived, umbrella in one hand and a grin in the other. He greeted Eshlin with a familiarity that didn't demand attention, but still lit her face when he appeared. He had been helping with the digital systems for the center, but it had become clear in the last few weeks that his connection to her was no longer just professional. They had started having coffee in the mornings after meetings, walks in the garden when Cale napped. There was something steady in Riven, something grounding, and Thatcher had seen it from the beginning. Now watching them speak quietly under the rain, Eshlin laughing at something only Riven could hear, Thatcher felt something ease in his chest. Not pride, not relief, but peace. The kind he hadn't felt since he was 21 and believed in simple futures. The ribbon was cut, the doors were opened, the Marigold Bloom Center was real. And so was the family it had built. Fragile, maybe, but strong in the way things are when they've been tested. That night, as rain tapped against the windows of the apartment Thatcher had bought for her, though she insisted on paying rent to feel independent, he read Cale a bedtime story while Eshlin watched from the doorway. Cale's tiny fingers gripped Thatcher's tie, tugging gently as he drifted off. The moment was small, quiet, domestic, and it was everything. When the lights were off and the apartment had gone still, Eshlin sat beside him on the couch, legs tucked under her, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" he asked. "For not giving up when you had every reason to." Thatcher reached over and took her hand, warm and steady in his own. "I had every reason to stay," he said. "I just needed to find you to remember them." And in the quiet hum of rain and healing, a family once broken sat together under one roof, no longer lost in the storm, but finally home.